Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Dulio. I'm a professor of political science here at Oakland University, and I'm also the director of our Center for Civic Engagement. Thank you for being here for After Roe, the Constitution, Rights, Policy, and Politics. As you may know, one of the center's goals is to make Oakland University known as a convener of conversations about issues of public importance. Tonight is a big step forward in making that goal a reality, given the topic that we're going to tackle, as well as the guests that we will welcome for this Lincoln-Douglas style debate. The topic of abortion has dominated our politics since Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito's opinion in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization case was leaked in early May. It has been a central issue in the 2022 campaign season. This is especially true here in Michigan, as it has been the focus of countless TV ads and is the basis of a ballot proposal to amend our state constitution. This context obviously makes it an issue of public importance. In terms of being a convener of conversations, I'm glad to be at a university that is not only not afraid to take on these kinds of topics, but supports, encourages, and welcomes diverse voices on campus. I couldn't be happier to have our two speakers, Jill Filipovic and Alexandra DeSanctis, here tonight with us. They are accomplished writers and opinion leaders. They are passionate in their opinions about this topic, but they are committed to having this conversation in the right way. And when I say right, I mean civil and respectful. Jill Filipovic is an award-winning journalist, lawyer, and author of OK Boomer, How My Generation Got Left Behind, and The H-Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness. She is a weekly columnist for CNN.com and a 2019 New America Future of War Fellow, where her project focused on access to safe abortion for rape survivors in conflict and post-conflict settings. Her work on reproductive health, human rights, and international affairs has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Business Week, and others. She writes regularly at jill.substack.com. Alexandra DeSanctis is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing writer at National Review. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, among other publications. She is the co-author with Ryan T. Anderson of the new book, Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. Welcome to you both. We're excited to have you. A couple of notes about how things will proceed this evening. First, attendees may post questions to our guests by way of the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. After our guests make their remarks, I'll come back and moderate those questions. We'll get to as many as we can. Second, I've mentioned the civil and respectful way I've seen our guests engage on this issue. This is a central component to our approach at the Center for Civic Engagement and to this conversation. Our goal tonight is not to change anyone's mind, but rather simply supply and offer good quality information. We also think we can help improve discourse on two fronts. First, we know that when people who disagree understand why someone else believes what they do, that person is more likely to respect that opinion. Second, our two guests are great models of civil behavior and tone, even on this most contentious issue. With that said, it's always good to remind ourselves of the Center for Civic Engagement's tenets of civic engagement and productive dialogue. Even on a contentious issue, we want to engage in respectful dialogue, employ honest listening, model civil behavior and tone, support free and open discourse, consider viewpoints other than our own, and find opportunities to agree, not just disagree. In true Lincoln-Douglas style format, the first speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, the second speaker will speak for about 25, and the first will come back with 5 minutes at the end to close. In addition, each of our speakers will shape their remarks around a resolution. That resolution is resolved: legal abortion is necessary for the freedom and equality of women. Enough from me. Let's bring Jill on to kick things off. Jill, welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. And thank you so much to Oakland University, Alexandra, everyone for being here and for opening up this space for what is, I think, right now, perhaps the most important time to be having this conversation. Legal abortion is necessary for the freedom and equality of women. Legal abortion is also necessary for women to live healthy lives, to raise healthy children, and to chart their own course. This isn't so much a question of opinion as one of well-established fact and pattern. All around the world, including in the US, women and girls do better when and where abortion is legal and accessible. They do better in school. They are better off financially. They live healthier lives. Researchers have looked at the very question of what happens when women are refused abortions, and the outcomes are objectively worse for those women than for women who are able to get abortions they seek out. Women who are refused abortions, researchers have found, are more likely than women who got them to be stuck living in poverty. They're more likely to be tethered to abusive men. They are more likely to wind up with mental health issues. Many of these women already have children, and those children wind up with more behavioral problems and doing worse in school than the kids of women who are able to end mistimed pregnancies. Women who are refused abortions are more likely than women who are able to obtain abortions to die, typically from complications arising out of pregnancy or childbirth. The advent of abortion rights, along with access to highly effective forms of contraception, ushered in radical changes for American women. Women flooded into institutions of higher learning like this one. They flooded into the workplace. The feminist gains of the last 50 years are simply inseparable from the legality of abortion and contraception. Women today are freer than we have ever been. And we have, in part, the feminist movement and the abortion rights and contraception rights that movement brought. The truth is that the anti-abortion movement thinks that this is a problem, because at heart, the anti-abortion movement is not really an anti-abortion movement. It's a religious traditionalist movement that seeks to put women back in our traditional roles as mothers and caregivers, and believes it's best if women are reliant on men, and if men are, in turn, the family's leader, breadwinner, and representative in the political, economic, and public spheres. That's a perfectly fine opinion to have, but it's not one shared by the majority of American women, most of whom do not, in fact, want to return to a pre-Roe, pre-feminist era. The American abortion debate would be more straightforward, though, if the anti-abortion movement were honest, that this is as much or more about gender roles and changing social norms as it is about abortion itself. All over the world, opposition to abortion goes hand in hand with the oppression of women. The nations that boast the best outcomes for women, the lowest rates of child and maternal mortality, the lowest rates of feminized poverty, the highest rates of female economic independence, also have liberal abortion laws and feminist-minded governments. This holds true in the United States. If you look at a map of the states with the highest rates of maternal and infant deaths, that map looks a whole lot like the map of states that have outlawed abortion since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. Anti-abortion states are more likely than pro-choice states to have the highest rates of children living in poverty. The anti-abortion movement and the Republican Party both call themselves pro-life. And yet, where those movements have the greatest political power, the highest proportions of women and babies die overwhelmingly of preventable causes. Legalizing abortion is not in and of itself sufficient for gender equality, but it is a necessary component. Everywhere pro-lifers have come to power, women and children have suffered. There is a much stronger correlation between feminist governance and support for families and children than there is between pro-life governance and support for families and children. That's one more reason I think it's so self-evident that abortion rights are necessary for women's freedom and equality. Where abortion rights have been scaled back, so too have women's freedoms and women's equality. Where abortion rights have expanded, so too have women's freedoms and equality, along with human rights, democratic norms more generally. When you look at where abortion rights have expanded in recent years, you see countries that are headed toward democracy. When you look at the minority of countries where reproductive rights have been curtailed and where anti-abortion movements have gained steam, and this list includes Hungary, Poland, Nicaragua, and most recently the United States, you see a clear correlation with rising autocracy. Abortion rights are tied not just to women's freedoms, but to greater freedom, period. The anti-abortion movement will tell you that this is about life. But even they don't really believe what they're selling, something we're seeing with Herschel Walker in Georgia right now. If abortion opponents really truly believe that ending a pregnancy is morally equivalent to murdering a child, how in the world are the vast majority of supposedly pro-life Republicans still supporting Walker after it has become pretty clear that he paid for a woman's abortion? And to be clear, I think the anti-abortion view that abortion is murder is absurd. But if we trust what abortion opponents say, if we go with their version of events, then Herschel Walker paid for a hitman to kill his child. Would Georgia Republicans and pro-lifers continue to support Herschel Walker if his story broke that he paid someone to murder a month-old infant? Would they shrug it off because, hey, everyone makes mistakes, God forgives, the past is the past? I hope not. But this is a useful moment because it makes clear this isn't about the question of life. It's women's freedoms that are the issue. I've been writing about abortion rights for 2 decades now, and never in the course of my work have I come across a single anti-abortion advocate who has demonstrated that they actually believe what they say, which is that a fertilized egg is the moral equivalent of a 5-year-old. Even the staunchest pro-lifer understands there's a difference between a zygote and an infant, and they act accordingly. I say that no pro-lifer truly acts as though a fertilized egg is the same as a baby because it turns out that Mother Nature is incredibly tough on fertilized eggs and on zygotes, and pro-lifers do exactly nothing to try to save those lives. Roughly half of fertilized eggs naturally don't implant and are flushed out of a woman's body. If we follow the pro-life argument that life not only begins at conception, but that every fertilized egg is the moral equivalent of you or I, that means that the global death rate just increased exponentially. And then America's child mortality rate is upwards of 50%. And the typical pushback on this is that, well, there's a difference between a natural occurrence like a fertilized egg not implanting and a decisive action like an abortion. The difference, abortion opponents would argue, is intent, the same difference between natural death and murder. But here's the thing. For the whole of human history, societies have gone to great lengths to prevent natural deaths. In our society,
I found this on the web.
Siri's talking to me. In my society, we expend far more resources. In our society, we expend far more resources trying to prevent nature from taking its course than we do on preventing and even punishing murderers. The past century has seen radical declines in infant mortality rates, thanks to billions and billions of dollars of investments and huge efforts to save the lives of the most vulnerable. And yet here we have, according to pro-life ideology, more than half of the world's smallest children dying before birth, and there's just nothing. No demands for research funding, no mention at all on the laundry list of concerns that make up the so-called culture of life. And that's not out of fealty to Mother Nature. That's because even the staunchest self-identified pro-lifers do not deep down think that a fertilized egg is the moral equivalent of a born child. And that's okay. That's as it should be. Mother Nature is messy and she rarely draws bright lines. The argument that life begins at conception is a perfectly fine one. It illuminates one entirely reasonable point at which to say that a human life begins to take its earliest form. What it doesn't illuminate is very much at all about abortion rights. We've seen the inherent messiness of reproduction play out since the Supreme Court overturned Roe and set American women back half a century. And we've seen it play out in the states where the anti-abortion movement has gotten its way and has made abortion a crime. There have been devastating stories that illustrate what happens in a so-called culture of life. The state of Ohio tried to force a 10-year-old rape victim to give birth. When she traveled to Indiana for an abortion, the doctor who helped her became a focus of so-called pro-life politicians and media hacks who first accused her of making up the story of the little girl she helped and then investigated her for doing her job. Over and over, abortion opponents and Republican politicians agreed. If a child is raped and impregnated, the only pro-life answer is to force her into childbearing. Think about that message. A child has been raped, and the powerful adults in her world tell her, your body is not yours. It's the same message a rapist sends. It's probably worth noting here that pregnancy and childbirth is the #1 killer of adolescent girls worldwide. But it's not just women and girls seeking abortions who have been impacted by anti-abortion laws. A startling number of stories have come out in the past several months of women with much wanted pregnancies showing up to the hospital having miscarriages and simply not getting the help they need. It's worth taking a moment here to explain what is mostly happening. When a woman comes into a doctor's office having a miscarriage, there are a few options. In some cases, she can safely go home and the miscarriage will continue naturally. In other cases, a doctor might offer a woman a drug to help the miscarriage complete or perform a procedure to do the same. Those last two options, those are miscarriage management, but they're also abortions. The problem comes in when a woman is having a miscarriage and a fetal heartbeat is still audible on an ultrasound. Many states that have criminalized abortion have done so very early in pregnancy, and they've made fetal heartbeat or the ability to hear what sounds like a fetal heartbeat on an ultrasound machine the point at which abortion is criminalized without any exceptions for a pregnant woman's health. Most of these states do have an exception for a pregnant woman's life, but what counts as a threat to a woman's life is ill-defined. What is clear is that the pregnant woman has to be in very acute medical distress to the point that refusing her an abortion would probably kill her. So if a woman comes in miscarrying and a doctor can hear a fetal heartbeat, even if a pregnancy is doomed, under the law of the state in which they are practicing, that doctor may not be able to help that patient safely complete her miscarriage until she's basically dying in their office. This is why you hear so many stories of women being sent home and told, come back when you have signs of a serious life-threatening infection. This is why we know that many women have wound up in the ICU, having medical emergencies that were entirely preventable, except abortion criminalization laws would not allow doctors to prevent these emergencies. We know women have lost their uteruses. We know women have almost died because of these laws. The anti-abortion movement often tries to deflect from these cases, or frankly is not always entirely honest. They say that these cases either aren't really abortions, or that the doctors could in fact have helped these women sooner because they said so. But the anti-abortion movement and anti-abortion politicians have written laws that are intended to intimidate doctors and health workers out of providing care to women in need. In Texas, for example, a doctor who uses an abortion procedure to save a miscarrying patient's life is not necessarily free and clear. He can still be hauled into civil court by anyone in the state who hears about what he's done. He can still be investigated and hauled into criminal court too, at which point he needs to prove as his defense that the procedure was absolutely necessary to save a woman's life. Medicine, though, doesn't always work like that. In an emergency scenario, there is no exact calculus of how likely it is that someone will die. There are probabilities, but every patient is different. And by the time the probability of death is 100%, it's too late. This is the reality that the anti-abortion movement has collectively thrust us into. It might be helpful here for me to explain a little bit about my work and why I care so much about this issue. I'm a journalist who's been covering reproductive healthcare for more than a decade. I've spent years reporting all around the world on what happens when abortion is illegal, what happens when women cannot get safe abortions, and what happens when anti-abortion activists get their way. I've seen it firsthand, and I can't call anything I've seen pro-life. I've spent the better part of the last 5 or so years reporting on what happens when women are raped in war and are impregnated by their rapists. What happens, largely thanks to so-called pro-life policies, is that those women cannot legally or safely obtain abortions. And while not every woman who has been raped in conflict wants an abortion, a lot of them do. In my years of reporting, I have met dozens of women who have been raped in a war that came to them and had lost everything, including many of their loved ones, and were living in hell and had no idea where they were going to end up or if they were going to survive this at all. And they had gotten pregnant by their rapists. And 2 to 1, the women I talked to wanted abortions. Overwhelmingly, they couldn't get them, at least not safely or legally. Not because abortions are hard to provide in refugee camps, they actually aren't, but because of the success of the global anti-abortion movement in stigmatizing abortion services, outlawing the procedure in conservative countries, and blocking US funding from going to a full range of humanitarian healthcare. Some of the women I met were forced to have children against their will. Most of them, though, had abortions anyway. Some got medication and it was relatively safe. Others, usually the youngest, the ones who were not literate and the poorest, tried more dangerous methods. I heard stories of hot bricks, burning the skin off of women's bellies, stories of drinking battery acid, of starving oneself into miscarriage, of inserting sticks and roots into cervixes. There is an enormous wealth of research on the very question of what happens when abortion is illegal or unavailable, and what happens is not that abortion ends. What happens is that abortions become more dangerous, more women are injured, more women die. Just never going to convince me that's pro-life. The pro-life movement, though, knows that this is what happens when you outlaw abortion. They're outlawing abortion anyway. The truth is that if the pro-life movement wanted to decrease the abortion rate, they could, because this too is a very solved problem. They have access to all the same information and data as the pro-choice side. And one thing you'll hear over and over again from abortion opponents is that pregnancy isn't a problem. It's workplaces that are hostile to pregnant women, or a culture that doesn't embrace motherhood, or a feminist movement that's trying to make women just like men. And the anti-abortion movement could try to solve some of these problems if they really believe that the problem is inhospitable workplace and educational cultures, or too high demands of work and education, or a lack of support for struggling women. There are a whole lot of policy solutions on offer. Just ask your local feminist group, because we've been working on it. The anti-abortion movement could support access to the most effective methods of contraception. Instead, their movement has funded efforts to make those methods harder for women to get, and not a single major national pro-life organization pushes for birth control access. The anti-abortion movement could make it easier for women to choose to have children. They could support paid family leave for moms and dads alike, better healthcare for women and children, universal childcare, efforts to end the wage discrimination that happens when women become mothers. They could lay the groundwork for more women to freely choose to have children, and feminists would be right there with them. But they don't do any of that. And in fact, the pro-life Republican Party actively works against those efforts. Instead, pro-lifers simply try to outlaw abortion, even though we know, according to a great many studies, and most recently, according to a decade-long study in The Lancet, that restrictive abortion laws do not actually result in lower abortion rates. In fact, abortion rates are highest in the same countries that broadly outlaw the procedure and only allow abortion to save the life of a pregnant woman. And by contrast, the world's most feminist countries also have some of the lowest abortion rates. The children who live there are healthier, people live longer. They are, I would argue, much more life-affirming places than those that throw women and doctors in jail. Every year, more than 20,000 women die from complications of unsafe abortion. Virtually none of those women die in pro-choice countries where the procedure is safe, legal, and available. One of the most important lessons I've learned as an extremely idealistic person with strong opinions is that I have to consider the best policies for the world I live in and not the world I want to live in. There are a great many things I find morally wrong, even profoundly morally offensive, that I still wouldn't outlaw, because in this world, the consequences of doing so would be even worse. I don't think abortion is morally wrong, but I would guess that some of you, maybe even many of you, do. And I would ask you to consider the reality of this world, not the world you prefer to live in. In this world, outlawing abortion doesn't end abortion. It does sometimes prevent the most vulnerable women from ending their pregnancies, largely women who are very poor or very young. That often consigns those women and their children to a life of poverty, and sometimes it consigns them to death. But outlawing abortion, we know, does not end abortion. It only makes abortion more dangerous. It leaves women dead and children orphaned. It means that women are not able to chart the course of their own lives. Legal abortion is necessary for the freedom and equality of women, and it's a necessary component of any culture that affirms and values women's lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. We'll bring in Alexandra.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start certainly by thanking Oakland University and David Julio in particular for hosting us tonight. And I definitely would like to thank Jill for agreeing to participate. This is now the third time she and I have had a conversation like this one for a college audience, and I'm really grateful that she continues to make these discussions possible. So our resolution tonight: legal abortion is necessary for the freedom and equality of women. You've heard from Jill why she believes abortion is indeed necessary for women. I'm going to argue that not only is abortion not necessary for women's freedom and equality, but in fact that legal abortion has harmed women in part by creating a deeply anti-woman culture. Before I dive into that argument, I want to respond to a couple of the most common claims I've heard about why women supposedly need legal abortion. Those of you following the abortion debate since Dobbs over the last couple months, I'm sure have heard the argument that without legal abortion, pregnant mothers will not be able to get necessary care in emergency medical situations. So this is one of the arguments Jill just shared. I think it's essential for the context of this debate, particularly as it's happening here in the US, to know that this is simply untrue. I've personally read the text of every pro-life law currently on the books in every state in the country to find out whether this is true. If it were true that women couldn't get emergency medical care because of abortion laws, I would be opposed to those laws, right? I think pro-life laws should always be written in a way that protects the life and health of pregnant mothers. You don't have to take my word for it on this. I collected the text of every law in an article at National Review. So if you want to go read them for yourself and do your own research, you can do that. Every pro-life law in this country has language permitting doctors to care for the health of pregnant mothers in life-threatening situations. And the confusion over this is because pro-life laws prohibit abortion, right? They don't prohibit any particular kind of medical care. They prohibit an act that directly and intentionally ends the life of the human being in his or her mother's womb. There is no medical emergency or complication that requires this. Now, it might be necessary in some cases, some of which Jill mentioned, to provide some kind of healthcare procedure that could have the unintended side effect of harming or killing the unborn child. But these types of healthcare procedures are not actually an abortion, and they're not prohibited under any pro-life law currently in place. There's no law making it impossible to get treatment for an ectopic pregnancy. There's no law making it impossible for women to receive treatment after suffering a miscarriage. And the confusion that we're seeing around these sorts of complications is coming not from the way the laws are written, but from the claim that these types of procedures are the same thing as an abortion. They're not. There's no known pregnancy complication in which directly killing an unborn child is the best means to save the life or protect the health of a pregnant mother. And yet this has been the primary argument from supporters of legal abortion in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned. There's absolutely no evidence for this claim. The laws themselves rebut this claim. And in fact, if you look carefully at the examples cited of women being denied essential care, you'll see in every case, doctors, pharmacies, hospital attorneys are misinterpreting, misapplying, misunderstanding the pro-life laws, precisely because of this conflation between abortion and necessary healthcare. So why is this the argument? I think we're hearing this because it's difficult to make a positive case in favor of unlimited legal abortion. So that brings me to my central argument tonight. We're debating whether abortion is necessary for women. Logically speaking, I think it's impossible to resolve this debate or answer this question until we're willing to establish what abortion is. We can't know if it's necessary for women until we know what it is, right? That's impossible. As I've already alluded to, abortion deliberately takes the life of a human being in the womb. This is a scientific, factual reality. Unfortunately, it's one that abortion supporters usually prefer to ignore. Jill didn't really address it super directly, but we simply can't know if abortion is necessary or good for women until we talk about what it is. And it's just not deniable that every abortion ends the life of a human being. These human beings have dignity and value simply because they're human beings like each one of us. Now, people who support abortion make all sorts of different claims about why this isn't actually true, about why the unborn child isn't actually a human being, or isn't actually a legal person, or doesn't actually have rights, or about the supposed hypocrisy of pro-lifers on this point. Factually speaking, abortion intentionally kills a human being. There is no non-arbitrary point at which to say that personhood begins if you deny that life and personhood begin at conception. So ultimately, the argument for abortion is a case that one powerful human being should have the ability to decide whether or not another weaker human being is not a person, is or is not a person with moral value and the right to live. So one powerful human being is getting to decide whether another weaker human being lives or dies. This is nothing short of tyranny. So what does this mean for the resolution we're considering tonight? We're not here to debate whether the unborn child is a human being or a human person. We're debating whether women need abortion. But I think these 2 points are obviously and intimately related, right? We can't actually make an argument about whether abortion is necessary until we grapple with what abortion is. If abortion were something like a toothache or getting an appendix removed, obviously women should have the right to go get it taken care of by a doctor or a dentist. But abortion is not like a toothache. It's a procedure that kills a human being. And we simply have to acknowledge that before we can make the argument about whether it's necessary or good. Now, here's what I want to think about as well. If it is true that abortion kills a human being, how could that be necessary for women? If Jill were correct that this were necessary for women, what would that say about our whole society? What would it say about us if women needed to do this to be free and equal participants in our economy, our social life, in order to have, good healthcare? How could any mother actually need to kill her child? How could she be more free or equal for being able to do so? Well, let me say this. I agree with a lot of what Jill said in her opening remarks. I agree that women find themselves in difficult circumstances that can make abortion seem like a solution. It's an undeniable reality, right, that women get pregnant and men don't. Men can walk away from the consequences of sex, and women, if they get pregnant, can't, which means that women face unique challenges as a result of pregnancy and childbearing as the result of our very bodies. And I agree with Jill too. Her overarching argument is that women should be able to control our own bodies, to order our own lives, and decide when to have children. I agree with that. And I think most pro-lifers do. All pro-lifers I know agree with that. But the problem is that we seem to disagree about what abortion is, right? The point at which each of us gets to control our own body and exercise our reproductive rights and decide when to have children comes before we've actually brought a human being into the world. Once a woman's pregnant, she is a mother and her partner is a father. That choice has already been made and their child already exists. So what kind of society are we if we force that child to die because his or her mother has decided it's not the right time? Of course, each of us has the authority to control our own body. Of course, we get to decide whether and when to have children. But if controlling my body or deciding when to have children means I have the right to end the life of another human being, that's where I have to draw the line. So where Jill and I disagree is when she claims that because women face these unique obstacles, that means we need abortion. Women who face obstacles to their freedom, equality, health, need assistance, need all sorts of things, many of which Jill and I probably would agree on, but none of those things are actually found in the ability to kill our own children. I don't believe that real freedom or real equality or real, bodily autonomy can justly be underpinned by an act of violence. If women sincerely believe, and many seem to, that killing their unborn child is the best solution they have to any set of difficult circumstances, then they are in fact neither free nor equal, right? Who could be free and equal if their freedom and equality depends on violence? They've been sold the lie that an act of violence will help them and that they'll be free and equal because of it. Now, here's the second main point I want to address tonight. I believe that every single one of us knows what abortion is. We know that this is an act that takes the life of an innocent human being before birth. And yet we still have countless well-meaning people insisting that this is necessary. Many of them try to argue that abortion doesn't actually take a human life. Others try to argue it doesn't matter one way or another whether it does. But I believe we all know. How could we not, right? We know that this is an act that ends a human life. And yet, like I said, many people are convinced very sincerely and very well-meaningly in many cases that abortion is nevertheless necessary. They believe this act of violence is so unavoidable and so essential, and that the consequences of getting rid of it so dire that it simply must remain legal. They argue that without this act of violence, women can't be full human beings. I disagree with this idea deeply, but I think it's important to take it seriously because it is indeed a serious claim, particularly if it is true. Our resolution tonight, embraced sincerely by many people who I believe have good intentions, is that women need abortion to be equal to men. Now, given what we've discussed about what abortion is, does that sound like a feminist proposal? I don't think so, and yet it's actually a result of feminist arguments that many people believe this. So let me take a step back for a minute and think about the roots of the feminist argument in favor of legal abortion. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, women's rights advocates were opposed to abortion without any known exception. They believed abortion was immoral, but they also believed it was bad for women. They argued that abortion placed the responsibility of pregnancy and childbearing even more on a woman's shoulders, rather than demanding men and society step up and do more for mothers and children. But that feminist perspective began to change around the time of the sexual revolution. Suddenly, our society began to prize consequence-free sex as a necessary aspect of human flourishing, of self-determination, freedom. And so second-wave feminist thinkers became committed to this idea that true liberation would require being able to participate in consequence-free sex. Not being able to do so, they argued, would inhibit women from finding true freedom and fulfillment. And so because of this, and it's kind of, it's easy to see where this comes from, these feminists began to argue that there's something deficient or even oppressive about women's bodies, because the very facts of female biology make the goal of sex with no consequences impossible. Think about it this way. It's a simple fact that sex can lead to pregnancy. It's a simple fact that women can get pregnant and men can't. So the facts of sex, the facts of female biology, make it impossible for women to participate in sex on equal footing in the same way that men can, right? Men can walk away from sex as though nothing happened, and women, if they become pregnant, can't. So because around this time, our society had begun to value consequence-free sex as this essential element of flourishing, modern women's rights advocates began in a very real and kind of disturbing way to hate their own bodies. They began to see their own bodies as an obstacle to fulfillment, as a roadblock to equality with men. And so in their worldview, you can see how contraception and abortion came along and became necessary to control female fertility, to make pregnancy less likely, to eliminate pregnancy, children, right, if they came along, so that women could pretend to walk away in the same way that men can. But I think there's really an uncomfortable hatred for women and for the female body inherent in all of this. Abortion stems ultimately from a deeply anti-woman philosophy, a mindset that prizes the male mode of embodiment and sees the female mode of embodiment as deficient. What's more, this philosophy uses the fact of male abandonment as the standard. It takes the fact that men are able to walk away and the fact that they often do, and turns that ability into an ideal. So instead of demanding, like the early feminists said, that men support women and children, this worldview began to demand that women be let in on the ability to abandon those who rely on them. But there's another problem with this. Abortion doesn't actually solve the female body, right? It doesn't magically turn women into men. It requires women to participate in an act of violence against their own children in order to pretend that they're participating in sex equally the way that men can. This is not a solution for women. It's another form of oppression. There are two ways of looking at the realities of biology. One is to argue that what my colleague Erica Bacchiacchi calls reproductive asymmetry is deeply unfair to women, and that abortion is therefore necessary because it will enable women to participate in sex just like men. This is where feminists are coming from when they say women need abortion to control their lives. Men get to walk away from the consequences. Why can't men? Except that for women, of course, the act of walking away is an act of violence and an act that violates her own body, which is a poor notion of equality, if you ask me. The second way of looking at this would be to affirm that men and women are in fact different, but that they're equal nonetheless. And it would respond to this reality by rejecting both male abandonment and abortion. So instead of saying to women, yes, pregnancy is this unique burden that you can solve with violence, it says to both men and women, sex is not consequence-free at all, right? It's for pleasure, yes, but not only. And if you bring a child into the world, both the mother and the father are responsible by the time that child exists. So neither mothers nor fathers get to walk away. That last part, I think, is key. Pregnancy is life-changing. It's entirely reasonable to be angry that we live in a society where men abandon women and children, but abortion doesn't actually solve a culture of male abandonment. It doesn't solve the supposed problem of the female body. It says to women, men are allowed to abandon you, but don't worry, you can commit violence and abandon your child too. In other words, I think a solution to the unequal burdens of reproduction that promises real freedom and real equality must respect the reality of what it means to be a woman. Women who want to control their bodies and their lives can't do it by pretending that pregnancy doesn't exist. A real solution requires recognizing that women can become pregnant and that it requires a greater response of compassion and support from our society. It requires a society that recognizes the importance of committed relationships between men and women, right? A society that values everything women are without rejecting their capacity for pregnancy and motherhood. Abortion instead treats women as victims of their own children and requires them to turn their children into victims in order to save themselves. I think this is a society that has failed women deeply. Abortion is like trying to put this little Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Think about how anti-feminist it is to tell women they can only be free and equal relative to men if they participate in violence. If you're a woman in the corporate world, they might say you won't have hope of climbing the ladder, reaching the corner office, unless you can control your own body, by which they mean, if you need to, committing an act of violence. If you're a pregnant mother who's not supported by her husband or partner or family, you can save yourself by committing an act of violence. But is abortion really what these women need? I think, like the early feminists did, that abortion is an easy way out for a society and a culture that is deeply anti-woman. If there are women out there who feel like they can't pay their bills or care for their children or succeed in the workplace or protect their health without resorting to an act of violence, they need major systemic changes to our society. They need a pro-woman society, not a society that tells them they're on their own because they're, supposedly empowered by the right to kill their own child. We've just seen the end with Dobbs of nearly 50 years of legal, nearly unlimited abortion in this country. And yet over that entire time span, there's been no serious evidence produced suggesting that the availability of abortion was a chief contributor to the increasing social participation or success of women. Nor is there any serious evidence suggesting that lack of access to abortion is a chief reason for women's lack of success, economic opportunity, or social advancement. Consider this. So the abortion rate after Roe began to rise pretty steadily, but it dropped off in the 1980s. It has been decreasing pretty significantly, steadily ever since then. Yet over the same time frame, women's success has increased by every key marker, even as the abortion rate was dropping. Educational advancement, professional success, economic opportunity, all of these continue to rise for women despite the drop in the abortion rate. Jill mentioned in her remarks that there's extensive evidence suggesting that women with access to abortion do better than women who are denied an abortion. She didn't mention a particular study, but typically what's cited to this effect is a study called the Turnaway Study, which was conducted by Diana Green Foster. The primary conclusion was that when women are denied an abortion, they experience greater economic insecurity or a higher chance of falling below the poverty line later on. There are several major problems with this study, and I think it's relevant because there, again, like I said, there's no evidence that abortion has been a causation for women's increased success, nor that lack of access to abortion holds women back. But this is the main study that's cited. So a couple main problems with it. Even at its strongest, it did not establish an actual causal link between abortion and female advancement. It had an 83% attrition rate, which means that only 17% of women who initially agreed to participate in the study actually followed the study through to completion. Typically, anything higher than a 20% attrition rate is considered a red flag about the validity of a study's results. And finally, about a third of the women who remained in the study and were counted as turned away actually later got an abortion or had a miscarriage, yet were continued to be considered by the study as being part of this turned away cohort. And on top of all this, the study's authors have consistently refused to make their complete questionnaires public or to make their data available for reanalysis to figure out if their conclusions were in fact correct. And like I said, even despite all these flaws, its ultimate findings never proved causation between abortion access and female success. In fact, it found that the women who were denied abortions were neither more nor less likely to graduate or drop out of school than women who did receive abortions. And it found some small differences in financial distress or access to credit, some of which were not statistically significant. Meanwhile, there is significant social science evidence suggesting that the legalization of abortion has contributed to a trend researchers call the feminization of poverty, which is primarily the result of a dramatic increase in unplanned pregnancies and non-marital births, the consequences of which, again, like the early feminists argued, have fallen mostly on the shoulders of women. And there's evidence that over the past 5 decades, women's overall happiness and satisfaction have markedly decreased relative to men, even as they've had almost unfettered access to abortion. So clearly the story is not quite as simple as abortion advocates suggest. I don't think abortion solves women's problems. I don't think it makes women free. I don't think it makes women equal. It's created an anti-woman culture because it's told Americans that women can only be free and equal if we participate in sex and in life as if we were men. Real equality would recognize that men and women are equal but different. Equality means recognizing the distinct way that women participate in reproduction and life and honor that difference by supporting all women, including those who become pregnant. Equality doesn't mean pretending that men and women have to have the same biology or pretend to have the same biology. It doesn't mean offering women technology that enables them to pretend they can function like men. Abortion doesn't serve real equality. It undermines equality because it offers women a false choice between their own freedom and flourishing and the lives of their unborn children. Real freedom and real equality would never force women to make that choice.
Thank you, Alexandra. Let's bring Jill back in for a 5-minute conclusion.
Gotta unmute myself. Great, thank you. So I mostly just want to briefly respond to some of the arguments that Alexandra made. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the argument that pregnant women have not needed abortion as emergency medical care is just not true. Alexandra's claim that there is no medical emergency that requires abortion is false. Dozens of doctors, lawyers, hospital administrative staff, and hundreds of other professionals have assessed the laws that anti-abortion folks have passed in conservative states and have assessed the situations that those laws apply to. Doctors have told us there are a whole lot of medical emergencies that require ending a pregnancy to preserve a woman's health, her fertility, or her life. The practice of medicine is unfortunately nowhere near as straightforward or as black and white as abortion opponents want it to be. It's possible that all of these lawyers, doctors, hospital administrative staff, professionals are misinterpreting the text of the law and that Alexandra is the person who's getting that right. I'm not really convinced. I have also read these laws. They are vague. They do not actually line up with the reality of what happens in gynecologist's office and in hospital emergency rooms. And when you talk to doctors who are actually having to face these questions in real time, that's what you hear and that's what you see. This is a debate about women's freedom and women's equality. And so I think one question that's worth assessing is which side of this debate, the pro-choice side or the pro-life side, has demonstrated beyond the realm of abortion a broad commitment to the rights of women and girls and to gender equality. And it's just not the pro-life movement. It's been the feminist movement that has pushed for a broad spectrum of laws to benefit women. Everything from outlawing many forms of discrimination in the workplace, to investing in women's education, to supporting mothers, and helping women who want to have children to parent safely. The pro-life movement, on the other hand, is focused on outlawing abortion. They haven't dedicated time, resources, political capital to expanding women's rights. They talk about caring about women's rights, freedom, and equality, but they haven't actually put any political might behind that. In the months since the Dobbs decision came down and Roe v. Wade was overturned, we haven't seen one single anti-abortion state put into place, for example, paid family leave policies, so that the women they're forcing to become mothers will be able to take time off and care for their children. We haven't seen them institute things like universal childcare. We haven't seen them unleash any kind of programs to help new mothers who are going to be struggling. What we have seen is a concentration of resources and political power into outlawing abortion, even in the most extreme cases. If we want, as Alexandra says, compassion and support from our society, the pro-life movement could do that. It could push to create all the support systems that would enable women to choose to have children, and frankly, to support the women who the movement is forcing to have children. They haven't done that. And they've often opposed feminists who have advocated for the very things that would enable women to choose motherhood and that would make motherhood better, safer, and healthier for women who choose it or who are, in our new context, forced into it. Alexandra also asks, is abortion really what these women need? And I would argue that I think that's a question best posed to women themselves. But even if you disagree with me, it's worth asking. What has the pro-life movement done to give women what they need? Yes, some individual pro-lifers hand out packs of diapers to women at crisis pregnancy centers. But that isn't lifelong support for a child a woman can't afford to raise. It doesn't get her a roof over her head or a steady income that she can live and raise a child off of. When you look at, again, which side of this debate has actually put its money where its mouth is, you see that the side that is advocating not just for abortion rights, but women's rights generally has advocated for women's rights. And while the anti-abortion movement may talk a big game about wanting to support women and mothers, when it comes down to how they are actually expending their resources and their political capital, it has not been in the service of women's rights. There are long records here on both sides. And I think if you look at which sides have prioritized women across the board in the context of reproduction and outside of it, you'll see over and over again that it is the pro-choice movement and the feminist movement that have put women's rights, equality first. And it has been over and over again the anti-abortion movement that has sought to turn back the clock and to set women back. Thank you.
Thank you both for your comments tonight, your passion. It's clear, obviously, that you're both passionate about this issue, but thank you for approaching it in a reasoned and scholarly manner, which is great to have on a college campus. We have a number of questions that have come in so far through the Q&A. Please continue to put those up there. We'll get to as many as we can. Because we have so many, I'm going to try to combine some where I can, because a number are overlapping. And I'm going to try to ask them in that way. But I'm going to start out in a little different mold, if you will. And this goes for both of you. But, you know, we've heard, and there's a number of questions on the topic of assumptions that people make, whether it's pro-life assumes about pro-choice. The pro-choice assumes about the pro-life side. So in your estimation, what's the biggest myth or biggest wrong assumption that the opponents to your view have about your view? We'll start with Zan.
I appreciate that question. I think one of the biggest arguments, or one of the most common arguments I hear that I think is a mistake about what I believe, is that the idea that life begins at conception, or that there's a human being in the womb who loses his or her life in an abortion, is somehow religiously motivated, or that the desire to regulate abortion is wanting to impose religious values. I think, I am a religious person, but many pro-life people are not. And I think that we're able to ascertain through reason alone, through science, that there is a human being in the womb. This is not a religious conjecture or religious belief. And the idea that human beings have rights and are legal persons, or ought to be legal persons for the purposes of our law, is not a religious imposition or a religious argument.
And I would say, I mean, on the pro-choice side, there are so many, it's hard to choose one. But I think chief among them is that pro-choicers don't care about life, and don't care about children, and don't care about fetal life. Or even frankly, that we kind of want to avoid some questions that pro-life folks think are kind of necessary components of this debate, including the question of when life begins. And every feminist and pro-choice advocate I have ever met cares a tremendous amount about life, and certainly about children. And I think you see that in the policies that we push and that we promote. And I think there's tremendous variation amongst pro-choice folks on the question of when life begins. I think most people on our side, though, will say that while that is perhaps an interesting and important kind of philosophical question, it's also a complex one, and isn't for us necessarily the starting or certainly the ending point of the abortion debate.
Thank you. And you picked up on some things that I am seeing, as I said, in the Q&A. And here's one that I think is indicative of how this debate has played out, not just since the Dobbs leak or the Dobbs decision, but really for decades, right? And it's about science. So here's a statement from one of our audience members, and I'm going to follow that right up with another statement from a different audience member, and ask you to comment on it. Number one, unborn humans are by all scientific accounts indistinguishable from born humans. And the next one, to me, it seems that the argument that life begins at conception is based in religious beliefs rather than science. So here we have folks on both sides are claiming the science mantle. So how do we, as non-experts, you two are the experts, right? How do we, as citizens who are, say, weighing a choice here in November about a constitutional amendment, how should we approach science? How do we weigh it? I'd just like to get your thoughts on those two seemingly conflicting views. We'll start with Jill this time.
Sure. The question of when life begins, I think, is certainly one. I don't want to say that science can't answer it, but I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. The moral status of kind of various phases of human development, right? I think we all know a sperm fertilizes an egg. That is one moment, right, where we can say life begins. You understand why people believe that. But that, I think, is quite a separate question as to the question of, well, then is that fertilized egg the moral equivalent of you or I, or, a 1-month-old infant, and should be kind of legally regulated by the same set of laws. And so I think there's only so much that, the science can tell us about these debates. That said, I think it is absolutely crucial to listen to what doctors are saying, to assess the scientific and the medical and healthcare reality, to look at studies about what happens when abortion is outlawed. I think all of this is quite useful information. And, of course, from the pro-choice side of this, I think most of it benefits my my argument, my point of view. So yes, I would hope that folks would do some research, would look at the medical consensus about the complexities of pregnancy and human reproduction. And, would frankly look at the fact that I think what abortion opponents are asking of pregnant women is something that is not asked of human beings in any other context in our country, and, assess whether or not we think that that's right and fair.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in on that. I think that the question of science is actually a pretty easy one when it comes to abortion. It's not scientifically disputable whether there's a human being in the womb. Something like 97% of biologists agree that life begins at conception. No sophisticated thinker denies that life begins at conception. The debate is over whether a human being in the womb has moral worth or is a legal person. That's an ethical debate, a philosophical debate, but there's no scientific debate about what this creature is. It is a human being. We can draw lines about when or whether he or she obtains rights, but to me, there's no non-arbitrary point past the moment when this human being comes into existence to say that he or she begins to have the right to life. There's just no non-arbitrary way to do that. And if we start trying to draw dividing lines about who counts as a person and who doesn't, then we're kind of back in the situation I referenced in my talk, where some human beings are having the power to decide which other human beings count as persons. And that historically has always been used as an argument for oppression. So I think that's what it is again here, but I don't think we should have any confusion about whether this is a scientific debate. It's not really up for debate in terms of science.
Thank you. Something that I think we're seeing play out here in Michigan has to do with the issue of extremes in the question of abortion policy. And we hear both sides use that term. So-and-so is extreme. Such and such this amendment is extreme in this way or in that way. So I guess my question to you is the public policy question on abortion, does it play out in the extremes, or is it more subtle than that? Is it black and white, or what are the different elements of it, if there are any, or is it just plain and simple, yes or no? We'll start with Alexandra on this one.
Sure, yeah, we can just rotate. To me, the question of whether something is extreme is less important than the question of what is the correct policy, right? If 1% of Americans thought that abortion was wrong because it ended a human life, that would technically be extreme, right? But I still think it would be the correct point of view. I don't really think that's necessarily the most helpful barometer of whether a policy is a good one. But I do think it's relevant in the context of American policy, because the fact of the matter is there's a very small percentage of people, maybe not very small, but a small percentage of people who think abortion should always be illegal, is always wrong. And then there's a small percentage of people who think that abortion should be legal at any time, in any place, for any reason throughout pregnancy. Those are, factually speaking, the extremes. And in the middle, we have a lot of Americans who, from the data I've seen, might call themselves pro-choice, but typically are quite close to my policy position on when it should be permitted, and not very close to the other extreme. So I think it's helpful in that context to think about it.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that Zan and I probably do agree on is that public opinion should not be dictating whether abortion is illegal or not. For me, I think when you're talking about things like fundamental rights, including the right to, sovereignty over your own body and what happens within the boundaries of your own skin and the most intimate parts of your body, I don't think that's something that should be up for a vote. And I think, like Alexandra, I wish it wasn't up for debate, but here we are. That said, I do think it's useful to talk about what I see as a lot of extremist policies coming from the right on abortion. Because when you do look at public opinion polling, most Americans do want abortion to be legal in some or all circumstances, right? The number of Americans that want abortion outlawed in almost every circumstance, except, in the most extreme, to save the life of the pregnant woman, that's a really, really small minority of Americans. And yet they are getting their way in a lot of conservative states right now. So that is unrepresentative, it is extreme. And I think it's well worth pointing that out, even if I wish none of this were really up for debate or a vote.
It's fascinating. And I want to ask a follow-up on that. I think your comment, Jill, about we shouldn't let public opinion govern this is fascinating. So what about in states where there are ballot propositions, or there have been, Kansas, for instance, right? And certainly here in Michigan, in your opinions, what's the best way to make this policy? Is it through ballot initiative? Is it through the legislative process? Is it some other way? And I guess I would ask that both, imagine that Dobbs didn't happen, and then we are dealing with the reality that it has been, right? So thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think the Roe decision struck a very, very good compromise, to be honest, which is that, essentially kind of first trimester, you can't do much to constrain the right to abortion. Later in pregnancy, the state has more of an interest in fetal life, and so can constrain abortion to some degree. And then after the point of fetal viability, you can really only legalize abortion in a smattering of relatively restrictive exceptions. That to me got it kind of as close to right as we're going to get it. The anti-abortion movement has been saying for years that if we overturn Roe, we can just leave this to the states and we'll stop fighting about it. And it's obvious that nothing has ever been a more wrong prediction than that, right? Abortion politics are more explosive, more divisive than they have perhaps ever been in American history. So I think the answer is that the government should largely be out of this. That said, that's not where we are now, thanks to this current very reactionary, very conservative Supreme Court. And so while it makes me very uncomfortable and to see, my fundamental rights being voted on in states, well, I don't think that should determine whether or not the state can force me to carry a pregnancy, essentially donate my organs against my will, something that we don't even do to corpses. I don't like that. But I think where we see it play out, for example, in Kansas, where we see the question put to voters, we see voters sending a pretty clear message. And it's a very, very different message than is sent in state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans.
I think I do agree with Jill that I wish this weren't something that's voted on, right? I think I kind of agree with the Abraham Lincoln view that there are some things that a democracy, it's not a true law, even if a democracy votes it into place, right? And I don't think that it's really a legitimate vote to take away, Jill talks about fundamental rights. From my perspective, that would be the fundamental right to life of the unborn child. I don't think it's legitimate to have a vote on that. And yet that's the way our political system is structured. And so that's possible. I'm happy it was taken out of the hands of the Supreme Court, because I think, the court in Roe found a right in the Constitution that doesn't exist. They invented a right that doesn't exist. And so our country and our political system is better off for having the debate taken out of that venue and actually being able to have a debate over this, right? I do think it's right that the people be able to debate and, things being what they are and our system being what it is. I'm fine with ballot measures. I'm fine with, legislators making policy on behalf of the people they represent, because it's much more in the hands of the people that way, right? We couldn't really do much as Americans to change abortion policy one way or another under Roe, but now we can. And there's a lot more ability for everybody, both Jill and I, to change people's minds as much as we can, for every citizen to have their voice and their vote. So I think in that regard, we're better off now.
And let's stick on that, on the sort of the legal, or actually the Supreme Court decision making for a second, as two people who have studied this more than let's say 99% of the country, right? You both know this better than just about anybody, right? So one of the arguments that we heard against Roe versus Wade was that it was bad law, that it was bad jurisprudence, that it was poorly decided. And I assume, Alexandra, that you would wholeheartedly agree with that. So I guess I'd like for you to delve into that a little bit. And then on the other side, Jill, would you take the same point and make the same argument about Dobbs? Is it a mistake from a legal standpoint? Talk about the right that is being debated in these constitutional questions.
Yeah, well, I really can't do a better job, I think, than the Dobbs majority opinion. I think Justice Alito explains very clearly how this supposed right was manufactured. There's nothing in the text or tradition or history of the Constitution that suggests that it was intended to protect a right to abortion. And the fact that this was imposed on the country by the justices was problematic, right? There was no legal basis for this right to have been invented. And in fact, the Supreme Court in 1992 in Planned Parenthood versus Casey essentially said as much, right? They didn't actually defend the holding in Roe. They didn't defend that there was a right to abortion in the Constitution. They said, well, now that abortion has been a right for the past 20 years, our society has come to depend on it, to organize itself around it. And so for stare decisis reasons, we can't go back on that. But even the Casey court didn't want to defend the substance of Roe. There really was nothing to it. And so while people might have been happy, certainly that abortion was legalized because that might be their policy preference, even very, pro-choice or people who preferred legal abortion, legal scholars have admitted for decades that it was poor legal reasoning, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? So it was just not good law, even if you don't like that, even if you did happen to like the outcome.
So unsurprisingly, I disagree. Look, the framers did not write the Constitution to say, we are going to reserve a small and narrow set of rights for the people, and it's only these rights as strictly interpreted, never to be expanded into anything else. What they did was a pretty brilliant thing, which is, write out a set of pretty expansive, pretty loosely worded rights that they extended to the people, essentially to protect our freedoms from government encroachment. And in the many, many decades since the Bill of Rights was written and has been amended, we've seen the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution in that kind of broad spirit, right? So many of the rights that the court has found over many decades that American people have are not directly enumerated in the Bill of Rights. It would have been impossible for the framers to write down an entire laundry list of every single medical procedure they were protecting. I mean, that would have been insane. What we've also seen is that some of what the framers kind of clearly understood and intended has changed as society has, and the separate but equal laws are chief among them, right? We know that when the Supreme Court kind of first evaluated that question of whether a racial group should be separate but equal, whether segregation is permissible under kind of a separate but equal framework, they held that it was. And when the Brown v. Board of Education case went before the Supreme Court, many decades later, they had an opposite finding. And, in that case, frankly, has been criticized by some conservative legal scholars as going beyond the realm of traditional jurisprudence and as not being a particularly originalist case. You don't find a lot of conservatives at this point criticizing Brown because it would be radically politically unpopular, but it really was Brown. It was that case that set into motion a series of cases that came after it, including Loving v. Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage, followed by Griswold v. Connecticut, which was the first of several contraception cases, followed by Roe v. Wade. These cases are all in a direct lineage. And then after Roe v. Wade, we have things like Obergefell, which legalized same-sex marriage. So Supreme Court justices understand, and Clarence Thomas wrote this in his concurrence in Dobbs, that the Dobbs decision wasn't just about abortion. It wasn't just about one bad case, they would say, which was Roe v. Wade. It's about this entire lineage of cases that have secured rights for minority groups and women for the most part. And that if Roe falls, also on the chopping block are things like Griswold, so things like contraception, are things like Obergefell, things like same-sex marriage, that once you kind of rip out the theoretical, philosophical, legal underpinning from a case like Roe and from abortion rights, you put all the rest of these rights that Americans are quite reliant on at risk. There's part of the reason why, except for in pretty extreme circumstances, the Supreme Court does emphasize, stare decisis, does emphasize consistency, right? Because societies do get used to having freedoms and rights, and women certainly have gotten pretty used to having a relatively broad array of civil rights. And that's important both for a society to keep functioning and also for the court to maintain its legitimacy. So I think that the Dobbs decision was bad on a number of grounds, but I think it certainly has done a tremendous amount to damage the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and to contribute to what I see as kind of a broader undermining of American democracy that is quite dangerous.
I'm so glad we got this question from an audience member, and it almost brings everything back to a fundamental level. And in terms of this this discussion, this debate, how we think about this issue, and it's a simple question about definitions and about how things get framed. At least that's how I think of it as a social scientist, right? But the question is there a distinction between the terms abortion and terminating a pregnancy?
Are we starting with?
I forget who went first last time. So,
I mean, I guess I'm not sure. I feel like I'm like about to get tricked. I'm not totally sure what that question is trying.
But we're not. This is not a gotcha moment. This is not. We're not trying to catch you in anything. I think it's an honest question.
The term abortion is actually also used kind of outside of the U.S. in English-speaking countries often as a miscarriage as well, right? So miscarriages are spontaneous abortions, and elective abortions are elective abortions, right? Because the process is similar to pregnancy ending. So I use the terms abortion and terminating a pregnancy interchangeably, but I guess technically the word abortion is actually a bit more expansive and includes events that are not necessarily elective.
Yeah, I find this question very interesting because one thing that would qualify, I think, too, as terminating a pregnancy would be giving birth, right? So typically when I see the phrase terminating a pregnancy used, I don't use the phrase myself because I think it's a euphemism. And usually when I see it used on purpose as a euphemism to kind of obscure that something intentional is being done, right? So a miscarriage is quite different from an abortion because a miscarriage happens spontaneously to a woman's body, and an abortion is something she typically goes in and chooses to have done to the child inside her. And you could terminate a pregnancy. A pregnancy might terminate a miscarriage. You might intentionally terminate a pregnancy by terminating the life of the child, or you could terminate pregnancy by giving birth. And all these things could be entailed under the umbrella of terminated pregnancy. So typically, I just use abortion, and I find it interesting when terminate a pregnancy is used interchangeably because I think it's typically intentional.
Changing course here a little bit. The from what you've studied, from what you've observed in maybe the wake of the Dobbs decision, and it certainly applies here in Michigan, given the 1931 law that's on the books that makes it that if it was being enforced, it would make it illegal for doctors to perform an abortion. And the question we have from the audience is, do prohibitive abortion laws make healthcare professionals afraid to do their job? And because if there is a need for that procedure in their mind, not putting words in anybody's mouth, but if they see it that way, it might be interpreted differently by somebody else, and therefore they would be afraid to take those steps. Thoughts on that is from a healthcare perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both touched on this a bit already in our remarks, but from the data that I've looked at, everything that's cited in my book, I think it's pretty clear that a direct intentional killing of an unborn child is never medically necessary. So there might be situations like an ectopic pregnancy or post-miscarriage treatment or something like placenta previa or uterine cancer, or situations where a mother might need a healthcare procedure that could harm or will almost certainly harm the unborn child inadvertently. But that's a distinct thing from an elective abortion, right? An elective abortion is when a woman goes in and says, I don't want to be pregnant anymore, and then undergoes a procedure in which her unborn child is killed. Doctors know the difference between performing that kind of procedure and helping a woman who's having a miscarriage or helping a woman who has an ectopic pregnancy, right? The idea that doctors are confused about this, to me, is just not easy to stomach. Like we all know the difference between these things. And I think the fact that we've all been trying to pretend for so long that abortion is a healthcare procedure is what's causing the confusion, right? There's no healthcare reason to directly kill an unborn child. And if there's confusion about it, it's because we're trying to claim that there is a healthcare reason for that.
So that's just not true. I talk to a lot of doctors. I interview a lot of doctors for my job, and a lot of doctors have spoken to the media. You can find these articles very easily on Google, who are all overwhelmingly saying there are situations in which ending a pregnancy is medically necessary to save a pregnant woman's life or to preserve her health or preserve her fertility. There are all kinds of reasons why a doctor may have to end a pregnancy. And this idea that like it's all just so simple sitting here in our living rooms on Zoom is just not the reality of the human body and of what doctors are dealing with in their offices and in emergency rooms. So I talked about miscarriage earlier. When a woman is having a miscarriage, and if there is a threat to her health, and miscarriages, sometimes really early in pregnancy, often will, pass naturally and she can go home and it'll probably be fine. And then there are other circumstances where miscarriage is much more complicated. And, if you do have and this is going to get graphic, and I'm sorry, but these are real stories. If you have a fetus inside of you that, let's say, there's a leg sticking out of your cervix in prolapsing into your vagina, that is not a safe thing for a woman to be walking around with. But if that fetus still has a heartbeat, under the law of, for example, the state of Texas, a doctor cannot perform a D&C procedure, which is kind of a very standard abortion procedure and would, in New York, be the standard of care for that woman. If a doctor does that in the state of Texas, that doctor is under Texas law performing an abortion and may have to then prove in a court of law to a Texas prosecutor and a Texas jury that was absolutely medically necessary, not just to preserve that woman's health, but to save her life, and is then going to be at the mercy of whether or not that affirmative defense is going to hold up in court. And even if that doctor doesn't get dragged into criminal court, any single person in the state of Texas can say, well, I heard that this doctor performed an abortion on a woman. I'm going to take him to civil court. I'm going to sue him and get my $10,000 payday. And even if that doctor wins in civil court, he's still in civil court, paying lawyers, potentially facing the threat of criminal penalties or going bankrupt or losing his medical license. The whole point of these laws is to intimidate doctors and healthcare providers and to make them think twice and three times and four times and call a lawyer and call a hospital administrator before they just give women the care that they believe is best in that moment. And we are seeing this play out. And this is the point. The point is intimidation.
Zan, over to you.
I already responded to this question. I could reply to that if you want.
Oh, no, we'll move on because we have just oh, you did.
That's okay.
I'm tracking the Q&A. I get caught up. We have hit every aspect of the subtitle to this event, except one. We've talked about the Constitution. We've talked about rights. We've talked about policy. Let's talk about politics for a brief moment. And another audience question. Do you think a pro-life Democrat or a pro-choice Republican will ever be their party's respective nominee for president?
No.
And let me then add a follow-up.
Yeah, sorry. Good.
Say about our politics? Is that okay? Or that's probably too normative. But what does that say about our politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it says that this issue is one that has become quite aligned with the two major parties. But what I do think is interesting is that abortion rights are not nearly as divisive as they're often discussed. Most Americans are pro-choice. Most Americans don't want abortion outlawed in every circumstance. We just saw in Kansas, in a pretty solidly red state, what happens when you toss this issue to voters. The anti-abortion movement has an absolute stranglehold on the Republican Party, which is why you see places where when Republicans are in charge of state legislatures, they are putting into place anti-abortion legislation that is far more restrictive and far more extreme than even their own voters typically want. There's a solid chunk of Republican voters, of conservative voters who are probably not as liberal as abortion rights as I am, but also do not want to see abortion broadly outlawed and do kind of frankly want the government out of these questions. I think that the Democratic Party, while of course it doesn't represent every single Democratic voter on abortion rights, is actually more aligned with your typical Democratic voter. The overwhelming majority of folks who vote for Democrats are pro-choice, want to see abortion rights protected. Conservatives in the Republican Party, frankly, are much more varied than their party's leadership.
So to start with the specific question, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think that someday there will be 2 pro-life presidential nominees. Now, I don't know when, don't ask me to tell you when, but I think there will be 2 pro-life, one from each party, presidential nominees. And I certainly agree with Jill that most Americans are not where I am on the question of abortion, but most Democrats don't actually agree with their party's policy on this. Most would call themselves pro-choice. Very few would actually want abortion to be totally illegal, but fewer than 20% of Democrats think abortion should be legal for any reason throughout pregnancy, which is the official party platform of the Democratic Party. It's the position that every Democratic politician now takes. So maybe that's not a point in favor of my optimism, but I do think that there are many, many Americans, let's say, to agree with Jill on this, who are not represented by their party in one way or another on the question of abortion. My optimism comes from the fact that I think now that this question's up for debate and up for policy making, over time, we're going to come to see abortion as a grave injustice.
So I have 2 more questions. We're nearly out of time. Actually, we hit 8:30, so I hope you'll answer 2 more questions real quick for us. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I think these are really important questions about moving ahead and moving forward in this conversation about this issue. So a question from the audience. Similar to the assumptions question earlier, how do you think each of your sides could better clarify your perspective or argument?
I think I'm supposed to go first this time. So the first thing that comes to mind is, and this is something I've been talking about a lot recently, especially in the wake of Roe having been overturned, I think pro-lifers have to get better at talking about women too. Now, for as long as I've been alive, the pro-life movement has been talking about loving both mothers and children. I think that that's good. But I think we have a lot of way to go, especially in terms of our politicians in speaking about abortion as harmful to both children and mothers, and in fact, our whole society. But in particular, I think pro-lifers have to be better at explaining why abortion is not a solution for women, and that we have empathy and sympathy for women in difficult circumstances, that we understand the desire to control one's own life, to determine whether or not they're going to have children. Being able to speak in that language is essential to being responsive to the other side, I think, as we've seen tonight. But that's not something that pro-lifers are necessarily always the best at articulating, particularly when it comes to politics.
Jill, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my view on sort of the strategy of the pro-choice movement is that we have to do kind of what works in different places. And the US is a really, really culturally diverse, absolutely massive nation. And what works in Brooklyn is not going to be the same thing that works in Kansas, right? And so I think when you're talking in Kansas, it's worth emphasizing what it is that resonates there, right? Which I think tends to be things like, we want the government out of our business. We want the freedom to make these choices for ourselves. one thing I think that we're seeing that I think the pro-choice movement is doing a good job at increasingly emphasizing is the sort of natural consequences of abortion bans and abortion criminalization laws, and emphasizing that even if you never get an abortion, even if you're a person who is not biologically capable of getting pregnant, these bans could impact somebody that you love. And that's going to be true, even if you are an anti-abortion evangelical Christian who would never even consider this procedure. If you are a person who can get pregnant, or if you care about anyone who can get pregnant, these laws, can come for you. And so I do think that is an area where the pro-choice side can do a better job at talking to people, not just about, oh, you may need an elective abortion, although I think we know also from the data that tons of self-identified pro-lifers and self-identified religious folks have abortions, but also emphasizing that these laws impact, of course, abortion access primarily, but also just the ability to be safe in a human body and to be pregnant, and to make really, really complicated and often not, sort of handled well by politicians, medical decisions.
Okay, last question. Undeniable that the politics in the United States is polarized. It is we're a divided country on a number of issues, this being maybe at the top of the list post-Dobbs. We've seen in that polarized environment, people lose friends. They've lost contact with family members over political disagreements. I heard you both say multiple times tonight that you agreed with the other, which is, for me, terrific, right? I think, as I was going through those tenets of civic engagement and productive dialogue, one of them was look for places that you agree, not just to disagree. And I think that is a great thing that's on display tonight. But my question to you is, what advice do you have for folks who are listening tonight who may have those strained relationships because of this issue? Do you have any advice for folks in talking to others who may disagree with them? And I can't remember again who goes first. So
I think I'm up.
I think you are too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can give you all the kind of usual advice, right? About like, listen and try to empathize and, try to hear it from their point of view. And I think all of that is important. And obviously in here, I think, civil discourse is incredibly valuable. I would also say, though, that when it comes to debating issues that feel so profoundly personal, it's also okay to kind of conserve your energy and your mental health, and your emotions for venues where it feels productive, right? If you keep finding yourself in the same kind of like spinning conversation with the same relative and it's the same kind of like head-butting debate, I mean, is that really worthwhile? I'm here because I think that this is worthwhile. I think having a formalized exchange of ideas with someone who I really profoundly disagree with, but I think is a person who's arguing honestly and in good faith, is useful, right? I am not somebody who's going to have like a 45-minute debate with Uncle whatever over the Thanksgiving table for the 26th year in a row. So, I would say it's okay to be choosy about how and where and when you engage in these conversations, and to try and do so in venues where you feel like it is actually beneficial to like literally anybody involved, and to not feel like, if you find it frustrating or enraging or draining, like it's okay to not have those conversations and to opt out, and to, I don't know, close the Twitter tab and go on a walk.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The first thing I was going to say was one form I've chosen not to debate in is Twitter. It's just not a good place to have fights. You don't change people's minds. No one's listening. It's just a shouting match. So there definitely are times and places where it's okay to just not share your opinion. But yeah, my two general points would be, the first is And I guess Jill sort of got at this and the importance of listening. But I really think that the biggest frustration to me in talking about this issue and to witnessing debates about this issue and seeing people write about this issue is I think both sides have a hard time hearing, listening to, accepting, and responding to the best arguments of those who oppose them. I think there's a real tendency to straw man, to just respond to the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's silly, right? If you really are convinced that your side is correct, you're going to be better off if you take the best argument on the other side and learn how to respond to it. So that's something I always really try to do, like hear the most sincere, well-meaning, strongest argument from the other side, take it seriously, don't assume bad motives, and learn how to respond to that. And it really strengthens your own argument when you do so. And then the second thing is just, it sounds simple, but hate the idea, not the person, right? People, I think, mostly are well-meaning, not malicious, and it doesn't do us any good to direct our ire at them personally, as opposed to whatever view they have that we find very wrong.
Well, that is a great place to end this evening. Alexandra, Jill, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. As I said, reasoned, well thought out, scholarly. It's great to have this kind of exchange of ideas. We are not on a college campus, but the Zoom campus will do for this evening. Thank you both. To our audience, thanks for being here. The Center for Civic Engagement has got a number of upcoming things that may interest you. Keep up to tabs, keep up to speed on those things on our website, oakland.edu/CCE. Thank you again. Good night, everybody.